You ever feel like you have to plan a lot harder for retirement than your parents or even perhaps your grandparents had to? Well, if you're feeling that way at all, then stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. And welcome to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels. And today we're going to focus on why it may not just be in your imagination, why it takes a lot more planning for retirement these days than it did for previous generations, but also some things that you can do to make it easier. So speaking of easier, Ms. Sarah, are you enjoying your weekend so far?
Oh, it's so nice to be here with our viewers, Dave, and of course with all of our listeners out there. But this weekend, it's nice to relax. But the week was a little bit boring, right? It was a bit of a come down from our New York City trip.
It was kind of. Hey, it's getting the end of lobster season. Have you gone out lobstering before the season ends? Or?
Not yet. I'm waiting for that mini season coming up in July to go down to the Keys and check it out.
You have to get out there. I know.
Oh,
I know how it works. You know, Justin makes the drinks on the boat, and you dive down and get the lobsters.
Yeah, but, I'm worried they might be all gone by now. Gotta wait for that mini season.
Well, you know, it's funny. There is a little bit of a letdown with what we came from a couple weeks ago at the New York Stock Exchange, ringing the bell. That was an awesome time, and that was never so publicized going back 40 years.
Yeah.
And I think the reason was because there weren't a lot of people in the stock market back then. I mean, we talked about just last week's show was about exchange traded funds. We talked about how the reason mutual funds, exchange traded funds became so popular was because 401ks started to exist in the 80s. So more and more people started to put money away, and more people started to invest in the markets. But if you go before that, people relied on the old-fashioned type pensions.
Yeah,
right?
That was a huge thing. Everyone had a pension back in the day, and now they're really almost non-existent.
That's right. And when I talk pension, of course, I mean, the type of pension where you get a lifetime income for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live. If you want to take a slight reduction in the pension benefit, you can get it guaranteed for both you and your spouse's lives. But today, it's all about the 401k, the 403b. Some companies have the old-fashioned pensions, but they're dropping like flies, it seems.
Yeah, there's some industries I know that still offer pensions for people, especially if you put in a certain amount of years, but it just seems like it's really rare. And to be honest with you, David, it kind of seems like the reason they did that is so it kind of takes the onus off of the employer to make sure they can provide for their retired employees, right? Instead, it kind of puts the onus on you because you have to worry about your 401k, you have to worry about your 403b, or at least you should be worrying about it.
That's right. You're in charge of your destiny and not the company. And that's why previous generations between Social Security and pension, they could at least, get by. They can do okay. But part of the reason, and we'll talk about this later in the show, is that that companies have passed that burden on to the employee is because of longevity. When they first started pensions almost 100 years ago, people retired. Maybe they lived for 5 years. The pension only got paid out for 5 years. Well, now people are living longer and longer, and that put a lot of pressure on these companies, which is why they've disbanded the pensions and put the onus back on the employee.
Yeah. Well, longevity's also put a lot of pressure on the Social Security system, which we know is struggling. And our Ask Dave question actually has to do with Social Security. So right on topic here. We have Zane in Washington. He says, I'm 52 years old. I want to retire in maybe 10 to 15 years, but I'm worried about Social Security being there for me. What should I do?
52. All right. Well, I think at 52, you're fairly safe, I would like to think. I've only got 5 years on you, Zane, so, hopefully we're both going to have it to some level. Now, will they reduce it potentially? Well, we all know that according to the Social Security Trust Fund, if no changes are made to the system at this point, that they're going to have to reduce the benefits by about 25%. But we also know that that's very politically unpopular. So Congress is going to do whatever they can. Probably wait till the last minute, which seems to be what they're doing. But they're going to wait, at some point before when the gun is up against their heads, proverbially speaking, they're probably going to go ahead and do something to fix it. But if you want to be conservative, Zane, take your projected Social Security benefits, reduce them by 25%, and I think that's probably a reasonable guesstimate. Again, I don't think that they'll do away with it. Now, if you're in your 20s, I may not count on it at all. But at 52, I think you're safe to count on 75% of the benefit to be conservative.
Yeah. Well, it's still not enough to live on, right, Dave? But we'll talk
No,
about that
not
more.
even close. That's right.
Zane, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers out there have a question that you want Dave to answer on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with our host, David Scranton, as we're talking about why it seems so much more difficult these days to plan and save for your retirement, and some of the big things that really go into it. We just answered a really great question on Social Security and will it be there for Zane, who's 52 years old. But part of the pressure really on Social Security, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, Dave, is the longevity situation.
That's right.
People are living past 100 years old, a decent amount of people as compared to maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago.
That's right. That's right. And it's great news if people stay healthy longer and they can enjoy life longer. The problem, though, is that it costs a lot more money. So the same pressure that caused companies to disband pensions is now putting pressure on the Social Security Administration, right, to pay those benefits forever. Because when Social Security first began, I believe the average recipient took it at age 65, but the average life expectancy was 67.
So a couple years.
Right, so you pay in the system for 40 years while
Right.
you're working, right? And then after 2 years of retirement, you drop dead, right? So
Right.
that was pretty easy to calculate.
So you pay in 40 years, government pays for you for 2 or 3 years. Seems pretty fair, right?
That's right. And, at the beginning, there were, 50 people contributing for every, one person collecting. Well, now there's, 3 people contributing, I think fewer than 3 for every one person collecting. And it'll only be another couple decades before there's only 2 people contributing for every one person collecting. And again, that's because people are living longer and longer. So it is putting pressure on pretty much everything. But it also puts pressure on you, right? Because, think about it, Sarah. In the past, if you thought you were going to live 10 years, you can say, okay, whatever I've accumulated in retirement, I divide it by 10, and I could spend 1/10 of it every year,
Sure.
and I'll be fine. And if you want to be conservative, maybe you spent 1/15 of it every year, assuming you lived 15 years, right? The problem is now with people living, into the 90s, and as you said, even over 100, people have to realistically plan for 30 years or more in retirement. And, if you take your account and you divide it by 30, that's, 3.3% a year. So you start to get to a point where it's like a mortgage, right?
Yeah, right.
Where if you take all your interest you're earning and you take a wee little bit of principal, then you can deplete that account within 30 years. Like, think about that, right? Yeah. First year you have your mortgage. What are you paying? All interest or all principal?
All interest, pretty much.
All interest,
Right.
yeah. And you're paying a wee little bit of principal, but somehow the way the amortization math works is next year you pay a little less interest, a little bit more principal, and somehow magically after 30 years that mortgage is paid off. Well, same thing in reverse. Like I said a moment ago, if you've got a pile of money and you live off all the interest and dividend and you spend a wee bit of principal, that money will be depleted after 30 years. So now imagine you retire at 65, right? You plan to take a little bit of principal and spend your money to between now and age 95. But you go to the doctor at the midway point, right? You go to the doctor at age 80, and he says, Sarah, congratulations. Man, I don't know what you're doing, but you're in the same health you were 15 years ago the day you retired. You're going to live to be 100. God bless you. Keep doing what you're doing. You're looking great.
Yeah.
But now you're halfway through retirement. You're going to be out of money in 15 years. That news from the doctor may not be such good news anymore, does it?
Right. It's a double-edged sword. It's good news, but it's also bad news if I'm going to run out of money.
It's a double-edged sword. That's
Yeah.
right. It may not be good news. Now, coming up, I want to share with you what is the silent killer. We've all heard that high blood pressure is the silent killer in the medical field, right? But what is the silent killer in the financial field when you're planning for retirement? All that and more coming up. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with my good friend and our host, David Scranton. And today's show, we're talking all about the reasons why it's become so much more difficult to plan and save for retirement. We've talked a lot about longevity, Dave, with lifespans have gotten longer and longer over the past decades, and how that's really put pressure on the Social Security system and how there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding it. Plus pensions. A lot of companies used to give pensions out. Now they're pretty rare, save for some industry. So Now that we've covered all that, Dave, I got to ask you, what's the silent killer for retirement? You teased it a few minutes ago, and I want to know.
Well, the silent killer, I'll give you a hint.
Okay.
I actually tested it this morning. And you know what it was?
What?
It was 124 over 73.
Oh, your blood pressure, Dave. I'm talking about
blood pressure.
retirement.
The blood
That's
pressure
what
is
our
the silent
listeners care
killer,
about. They don't
okay?
care about your blood pressure.
So what is the silent killer in the inflationary in the financial world? I just let the cat out of the bag. It's inflation. Inflation is the silent killer because it just tightens the dollar and puts more and more pressure on you and your ability to spend. And it's insidious, so it creeps up slowly, and that's why blood pressure is called the silent killer, because you don't feel it, but all of a sudden it starts to have other effects on the kidneys, on the heart, the eyes, everything, right? And the same is true with inflation. And it's funny, Sarah, because when I got into the business in the 80s, we were all making assumptions of 4 or 5%. So if you're going to assume inflation's 4 or 5%, you assume the cost of living doubles about every 15 years. Right? So by today's standards, that means that if you're going to live 30 years, the cost of living quadruples over that period.
So you need 4 times more money, essentially, than what you were thinking.
That's right. So if you say I need $75,000 a year to retire now, you might need $300,000 by the time you get into your 90s.
Well, it's hard to imagine, Dave, those numbers.
It is.
Yeah.
And we see, and we got lazy so far this century with this because inflation was 2%, and we're just forgetting about it. So negligible, we're not even worried about inflation. But we just got a gross reminder over the last 12 months or so how bad inflation can actually be. So if you talk about 4 or 5% as an average, it's probably not a bad rate to give you a little bit of a cushion.
Yeah.
And of course, we've seen over the last year times when we've been an annualized rate of 7, 8, or 9%. So again, inflation is one of the biggest issues that has crept up, and it's kind of the kissing cousin of longevity, right? Because the longer you live, the longer inflation can affect you.
Right. And the more your money gets squeezed, basically,
and
your retirement savings.
You can't ignore it. That's correct.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a huge problem, Dave. I think the other big problem, too, is really healthcare inflation and really the cost of healthcare overall. Our Ask Dave question comes from Claire, actually, in Georgia. And she says the rate of inflation for healthcare, I've heard, is much higher than just the regular rate of inflation. If so, what do I do? How can I handle this, Dave?
Well, you have two issues. I mean, first of all, you have the rate of inflation is higher on healthcare cost than a normal cost. That's true. But the bigger issue is just planning for those healthcare costs, right? A lot of people work during their lives and they get, group benefits paid for, or the majority of them paid for in terms of medical. And then they retire and all of a sudden it's not free anymore. Remember, Medicare Part A is something you're eligible for. It's free. Medicare Part B, you pay for, and it's taken directly out of your Social Security benefits. And how much you pay for Medicare Part B, in part, depends upon your income from other sources. So it varies.
Yeah. So it's kind of a sliding scale. If you don't have a lot of income, you pay less for someone who has more.
That's right. And part of the problem, by the way, with inflation, just getting off this inflation thing, but is that Social Security in theory goes up; those benefits go up with inflation. But what happens is because Medicare costs go up even faster, they increase the Social Security benefits with one hand, and they take it away with the other hand with increased cost of Medicare Part B. So in many years, you might get an inflation raise on your Social Security, but most of it is taken back. Yeah. So part of it is, paying for Medicare Part B. Part of it is then paying for Medicare Part D, or a supplement, because you need a supplement or you're going to have high deductibles and co-pays that most people really can't afford to take on, right? So you've got to factor that in. Then you also have to factor in long-term care, right? Medicare will only pay for 100 days worth of convalescent care, and that's it. And that's not even full-time home health care. If you need convalescent care for more than 100 days, then guess what? You have to pay it out of pocket. And Medicare doesn't do that. Medicare supplements don't do that. You have to pay for it out of pocket. And that's where long-term care insurance comes in as a consideration. And by the way, if you want home health care, well, then you better have long-term care insurance, or you better have accumulated enough assets so that you can self-insure. So absolutely, yes, medical inflation is much higher than the regular rate of inflation, but that's not just the inflation rate, it's the actual costs of medical expenses that are now going to get passed on to you.
Yeah. Well, Claire, thank you so much for sending in your question for Dave to answer. And if any of our other listeners or our viewers out there have a question that you want Dave to answer on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. You are listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with my host, Dave Scranton, and we are talking all about the ways that retirement has become so much more difficult to plan and to save for, and some tips and some solutions for you and what you can do to make sure you're planning and saving the right way. So, Dave, inflation we know is high. We know healthcare costs, healthcare inflation is high. I've talked a little bit about on the show before about my grandmother and my parents trying to find in-home health care for her, and it's
Right.
$10,000, $12,000, $15,000 a month, and she lives out in North Carolina, so a small little town out there. It's not the big city, but it's still very expensive.
It is. And, if you think back to the Waltons or you think back to Little House on the Prairie, that a lot of our listeners and YouTube viewers will remember. Have you ever seen any episodes, Sarah? See, this is where I'm going to age myself, everybody. You ready here? Have you ever seen one single episode, Sarah, of the Waltons or Little House on the Prairie?
Yes, Dave. My mom loves oldies, so I grew up on all those old shows.
Yeah.
The Andy Griffith Show, absolutely.
Okay,
Really
there
old
you go. Okay.
MASH.
Well, thank you for making me feel slightly better about myself.
Yes, I
That's
watched
awesome.
all those shows.
But back in those generations, Walton's, A Little House on the Prairie, we have families took care of each other. You took sick, you were in the house. You lived on the farm. You took care of your family members. It was really easy. And at that point, you didn't have a lot of personal assets. So if you had to go to a convalescent facility, there wasn't a lot for them to attach because most of what you had was the pension and the Social Security. But it's different now. It's different because families are a much different structure today. So they're not having three generations living in one house, and most people today would never want to have three generations.
Right?
living
Yeah,
in
they
one
do
house.
that for to maintain their sanity, right?
That's right. That's right. Self-preservation.
Right.
But also you have assets with 401ks. You have assets that can be essentially taken by the state if you have to go into a convalescent home, or could be spent down if you need full-time home health care because your family's not there to help you. So that's what's changed a lot also with healthcare.
Yeah. Well, besides long-term care insurance, are there other types of life insurance? Are there other things that people can do to try to shore up their healthcare defenses now before they get to their 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Well, in life insurance, is something that most people say they don't need anymore really because they retire and they're living off their investments. But some people do maintain life insurance. Gosh, we could do a whole show on why maintaining life insurance, where it might be a good thing and where it might not be such a good thing. The biggest thing I think is there's errors in planning, Sarah, that occur. People, when they're planning for their own retirement, they think, well, inflation is on all these fun things that I want to do. It's all the travel and everything else. And I've only got so many go-go years, right? So I'm going to travel, I'm going to travel and maybe deal with inflation from age 65 to 75 or maybe all the way to age 80. God willing. And at some point, my go-go years are going to stop, and I'm not going to want to travel anymore. I'm not going to have the energy or the health, right? And that's good in theory. But what tends to happen is when those costs start to diminish, medical costs kick in. And when those medical costs kick in, now you've got even a higher rate of inflation. So everybody thinks they're going to get some reprieve from this silent killer we call inflation. Yeah. But they really don't get a reprieve. It just changes its form.
Yeah.
And, life insurance can be a good idea. That's, there's only a 2-year suicide exclusion on most life policies.
Oh, geez, Dave, we're taking a dark turn here.
Well, if you take really sick, I guess you could always, as long as your policy has been enforced for more than 2 years, you can always call Dr. Kevorkian or I guess his heirs. I guess Dr. Kevorkian's dead, but call his heirs and, your spouse will get the life insurance. You'll be okay, right?
I really hope compliance isn't listening to this. This is not financial advice here. All right. Well, it's not just healthcare inflation or regular inflation that's putting a burden on people looking to retire. There are some unique burdens that are facing those that are baby boomers and even now in the Generation X generation. So we're going to talk about what some of those burdens are and ways you can relieve them in just a moment. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about your income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with David Scranton. And so far on today's show, we've covered a lot of different factors that can make planning and saving for retirement much more difficult than our parents, grandparents had it in the past. So we've covered longer lifespans and why that's a double-edged sword, as well as the disappearing pensions, the Social Security uncertainty a lot of people are facing, and will it be there for them or not when they retire. Plus inflation, the silent killer. We know, Dave, it's blood pressure, but in retirement and on your retirement investments, it's really inflation.
That's
so let's talk now about really some unique burdens that are facing those that are in the baby boomer generation, the younger baby boomers, and the older Gen Xers, because there are some unique burdens out there that's only they're facing it. You know, one of those things I think is that being the sandwich generation, right?
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, before we get into that, though, I've got to ask you, you told people they're listening to the Retirement Income Source, but last week you had that device that locked people in so they couldn't change the tuner, and you said they were locked in. Aren't you locking these listeners in for us this week, or what?
It's a beta technology, Dave. We got to test it every few weeks. So
But you're not using it this week?
we can't lock them in every week,
Well,
unfortunately.
why can't we lock them in this week?
This week
is
it's
good stuff.
voluntary.
This is good stuff we're talking about today. They want to hear this.
This is good stuff. I agree.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, I guess you're not locked in. So let's talk about what, you know, some issues you might have with your parents first and foremost. I know, Sarah, you talked about some things with your grandparents.
Yeah.
I dealt with it with my mom. You know, we had expenses of about $12,000 a month. And gosh, you know, my mom's been gone now. It'll be 10 years at the end of this year. She's been gone. And even that far ago, it was in the Northeast, at least, it was $12,000 a month for full-time care. Now, fortunately, you know, I'm blessed that I was able to pay that. I was able to help her with it. It wasn't a big deal. But some people aren't, you know, and they go into debt to try to help out mom and dad to pay some of those home health care expenses. They go into, they start spending down retirement savings and maybe jeopardizing their own financial security.
Yeah.
Or in a lot of cases, I see this with a lot of clients, Sarah, where people just will come over and you know, they disrupt their entire lives and they're the caretaker.
Yeah.
So, for example, you got a husband and wife. Sometimes, you know, she might retire early because women are better caretakers than men are.
Oh,
right?
yeah. That's what the science says, right, Dave?
That's right. When Justin's sick, I'm sure you could take care of him. When you're sick, he's probably useless, right? That's
Pretty much. I
That's
think
how-
that's kind of universal,
That's
right?
universal. Same thing in my household. I blow the whistle on myself. But so this is where I see a lot of times that'll happen where, you know, she might retire early and now they have less money to save for retirement. And now she's exhausted because she's spending 12 hours a day. She's going back and forth. And it's challenging. And then when dad finally retires, now, okay, he retires, but now does he really want to retire? Does he have anybody to spend time with if she's going back and forth to mom's house every day, spending the entire day as a caretaker? So there are lifestyle and time constraint issues, but there are also financial issues. I mean, I've seen it go both ways.
Yeah. And when I said the sandwich generation, you know, when you think of a sandwich, you've got the retired people in the middle, right? And on one end, we have the elderly parents that maybe
That's right.
are living in the home if you're lucky enough to have a family dynamic like the Waltons or Little House on the Prairie, right? And then you have the other bread, right? Which is the kids, the useless kids that won't get out of the house and the failure to launch, right? So that kind of leads us to our Ask Dave question. So we've talked a little bit about when the parents come back or if you need to go live with your parents and take care of them. But what about the opposite side? So we have a question from Daniel in Kansas. He says, Dave, you talk about parents living with the children, but I have a 35-year-old child who keeps moving back in and moving back out every few years. It's really affecting my ability to retire, and it's also affecting my relationship with my wife. What should I do?
Well, that's a great question, and yeah, I guess it depends. And who's this listener now? What's his? I'm sorry.
This is Daniel in Kansas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. You know, good with numbers, bad with names. That's how we math people roll.
Trade-off.
Yeah. So Daniel, the reality though is that it depends. You know, is your son disabled or not? You know, I have a really good friend whose son has an emotional disability, and it puts stress on their relationship, and he's older. And he just won't leave the house. He can't leave the house. And that's one thing, and that's difficult enough. Or is it really just that, you know, maybe just your son hasn't gotten his act together career-wise? I mean, it's back in the day, the reason it was easier with the Waltons, the reason it was easier, you know, with Little House on the Prairie, it was simple. Just, hey, get your butt out of the house, go work on the farm, right? That's
Right.
That's what
There's
you
only
do.
a few options out there.
That's right. It's really easy, right? And now it's different because somebody actually has to figure out what they're good at. They have to go out and they have to interview and get a job. And some people might not have good interview skills, or they might have good interview skills, but maybe they don't have that extra oomph to keep the job. And then every time they lose a job, they keep coming back in. So Daniel, best advice I can give for you, and I'm going to talk about this more, so stay with us after this, but is that, sometimes it's got to be a little bit of tough love. If you've saved enough money for your own retirement where you're okay, then, maybe it's okay to support your son, not a problem. Of course, barring the issues you have at home with your wife, because, that's something the two of you have to work out. And my best guess is Mama probably wants to baby her little boy, and Dad's probably saying, hey, get out there and I had kids when I was 35. Get out there and take care of yourself. That's usually the dynamic. But even if not, bottom line is you got to get the personal side taken care of. But financially, if you have enough money to retire, you can afford it. Okay, maybe it's okay financially. But if you don't, a little tough love goes a long way. Don't hurt your own chances of retirement, because, one thing, you want to take care of them, but guess what? You also never want to be a burden to your kids. And that's what could happen if you start spending out of your retirement monies or stop saving for retirement because you're so worried about taking care of your son at home.
Yeah. And that's why we always kind of joke that financial advisors aren't just financial advisors, right, Dave? A lot of times they're therapists, they're marriage counselors, family counselors. So.
That's right, Bob Newhart. That's what they call me, Bob Newhart.
Bob Newhart, Dr. Scranton. All right, Daniel, thank you so much for sending in your question. I hope that Dave's answer helped you. And if any of our listeners, our YouTube viewers out there have a question that you want Dave to answer, you can send it to us via email. Just email us. It's askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels. I'm here with Dave Scranton, and we've talked about all the ways that retirement and planning and saving for retirement have become so much more difficult. Mm-hmm. So Dave just answered a really interesting question about what happens when your kid won't leave the house. What if they keep moving back in and out of the house? Right. And I do think it's a different situation, Dave, if you're dealing with a kid or somebody, an adult child that has a disability, versus the adult kids that just can't get it together. And I'm sad to say I know a couple of these people that they're closing in on 35, almost Daniel's son's age, and they still haven't figured it out. And back in the day, and their defense and the younger people's defense, since I am a little bit younger than most of our listeners and viewers, it was easier to support a family on one income, right? You could get married, you could have a couple kids, you could live the American dream making $50,000, $60,000 a year. You stayed with one company 30 years, you retired, got the Rolex and the pension, right? Yep. Times have changed. There's a whole lot more going on in the world now, Dave, than we've ever faced before.
No, times have changed. That's why we've talked about all these things so far that you just mentioned, But this issue of parents and children, you kind of have to be there for your parents. I mean, you can't abandon your parents. You've got to take care of them. They took care of you when you're younger. You've got to do whatever you can. Yeah. But even then, if a parent, if it's going to really hurt your retirement to a point where you may never be able to retire, or you might be a burden on your kids, there might come a point where you have to make a tough decision and say, okay, maybe they do need to go in a convalescent facility. Maybe they do need to become a ward of the state. If you're exhausting yourself trying to care for them yourselves, or you're exhausting your retirement funds trying to care for them financially. The kids, though, are in theory a little bit easier. Of course, you have to agree. Mom and Dad have to agree with this. And like I said before, a lot of times they don't agree. One's got the tough love approach, and the other one is, wants to take care of the children at home. But the reality of it is that you also never want to be a burden on your kids. So like I said, you really have to say, okay, if that's my goal, sure, and sometimes Mom and Dad know what's better for the kids better than the kids do. And that's true when they're young, and that's true when the kids are in their 30s, right? Yeah. The kid may think, hey, great, come on, Mom and Dad could take care of me for a little while. They're rich. They got enough money, right? Because to somebody younger, maybe $500,000 in a 401k is a lot of money. And so they think it's okay, but they're not fully thinking through that, hey, if I put too much burden on them and hurt their retirement, guess what? I may have Mom and Dad moving in with me in my later years, and I don't want that either, right?
Right. They're not thinking about that part.
That's right. That's
they don't want to imagine that possibility,
but they should.
Right? Right. Well, it also affects their parents' the ability to travel, to really accomplish those retirement goals, those things you want to do. Maybe if you have some dead weight at home with your child or something else going on. So, David kind of chatted about this just a moment ago, but we've talked some general factors, some things that really are affecting everyone's retirement. But I want to get more in in depth with the economy, what's going on in the finance world, and why today's challenges are so unique to people that are at retirement or retiring right now. So
And today's challenges, you mean literally just even over the last year, the challenges
literally
have
within the
increased.
past year. Yeah.
So I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and we've put together quite a show here today, as so far we've covered all the differences, or a lot of the differences, I should say, that make planning for retirement for this generation much more difficult than previous generations. We covered longevity and the fact that today you have to plan for retirement that could be 30 years or longer. We talked about healthcare costs, and the longer you live, the more you might need healthcare costs. How about inflation? We forgot about inflation for a couple decades earlier this century, but we've been reminded, we've been slapped in the face with inflation just over the last year or year and a half or so. And then we talked about possible additional burdens from having to take care of parents or children, that is being part of the dreaded sandwich generation. And now, Sarah, let's talk just a bit about, current things, current timely things that affect investors today, that make it, and I mean just the last couple of years, that make investing for retirement more difficult than ever before.
Yeah. Well, I kind of mentioned a little bit, Dave, how in the 80s and the 90s, the American dream was possible on one salary, right? And typically, mom and dad worked, mom stayed home. You had a couple kids, you worked for the same company for 30 years. And just within the last year or so, it's completely changed. So what do you think is contributing to that?
Well, it's been gradually changing over time. And, part of that is inflation. A lot of industries' wages have not kept up with inflation. In fact, even now, when we have high inflation over the last year, wages have not kept up with inflation. So it's still a challenge. So again, that's like a silent killer for an employee.
Right.
That's feeling things getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And then cost of university and college has gone up, right? So if you want to get your kids off to a good start, that gets more expensive. Yeah. And the burden of planning for retirement is now on you. So it's easy to live off one income when you don't have to save any money for college or retirement.
Right. Yeah.
But when you got to save for those things, that's where the second income goes.
It becomes difficult. Absolutely.
But it's more difficult today and more scarier today, the decisions people have to make in large part because of this unprecedented laboratory experiment that the Federal Reserve has done since 2008. And you know what I'm referring to here.
Right. Well, I know what you're referring to, but how you should explain to our listeners and viewers so they understand too.
Yeah, when we had the financial crash in 2008, we turned the corner where the Federal Reserve started printing money. They did all this quantitative easing, printing money, artificially stimulating the economy. I call it steroids for the economy, right? And you know that if an athlete takes steroids, their performance may get enhanced, but it's only temporary. It's only where they're on the steroids. When they go off the steroids, you don't have a clue what's going to happen, right? And unfortunately, those steroids just got boosted even worse when we had the pandemic. And now not only was it the Federal Reserve printing money and quantitative easing and driving down interest rates to zero, but it was also Congress now handing out stimulus checks to companies and individuals, right?
The PPP loans, all of that.
So now you took that weightlifter in the gym, and not only did you give him steroids, but now you threw in a couple shots of growth hormone along the way. So now he's bench pressing 400 pounds. And you and I could sit here and wager, right, gosh, okay, we take this guy off the steroids, we take him off the growth hormone. How much can he bench press? 250, 300, 3.25, right?
Maybe less.
Maybe less. We don't know, but it's all a guess. And that's where we are right now with the economy, because we don't know where the economy should be. We don't know where the market should be once the steroids are taken away from our current economy. And the Federal Reserve had this big lab experiment really for about 14 years at low interest rates, and they just reversed trend a year ago. And we do not know how that financial laboratory experiment is going to turn out. Sometimes you have a laboratory experiment and you mix two chemicals together and you get a harmless solution. Other times you get a laboratory explosion.
Right.
And that's what makes planning today so difficult, is you really don't know which is going to happen, because this is completely unprecedented. And the unwinding, again, just began over the last year. And that's why I said this is really a very, very recent added difficulty that people are having, when they come to plan for retirement.
Right. Well, I think a lot of people are worried that the U.S. dollar could collapse, including our next Ask Dave, our next listener, Kirk out in Wyoming. He says, Dave, I'm worried about the dollar collapsing. I'm thinking about investing in gold or silver, or maybe even more in Bitcoin. What do you think?
All right. Well, if you're a regular listener to the show, you already know the answer, right? And it's that, I think in most cases, those are probably not wise if you're over the age of 50 or approaching retirement. There's a few reasons why. Number one, gold did not do well at all last year, and we had a high inflationary environment. So this whole thing about gold being an inflation hedge is really a rumor. Maybe that was the case back when the dollar was pegged, to gold, but it's not anymore. It hasn't been for 50 years. So it's really not a great inflation hedge in any way, shape, or form. And Bitcoin last year lost 75% of its value. That's not a good inflation hedge. And the biggest issue about all these coins or metals is that you simply, they don't provide income. And the best way to have an inflation hedge is to get income that's going to go up every year. And when you're retired, you need income. You need income to offset inflation. And unfortunately, these types of tools simply don't do that.
Well, Kirk, I hope that answered your question. And if any of our other listeners, our YouTube viewers out there want to ask Dave your retirement question, send us an email. It's askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You are locked into the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. Yes, Dave, we got the all clear from the FCC. We can lock them back in. And it's good because I think this might be one of the most important parts of the whole show, right?
Right.
So you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, and it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and we're wrapping up today's show about why it's so much more difficult these days.
Already?
Yeah, I know,
We're having
Dave.
too much fun wrapping up
I
already.
know.
This isn't fair.
I know. Well, I want to get the last bit of good information out to everyone before we finish up for this week.
Time flies.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, some hedges and some against inflation and some things that people can do, Dave.
Yeah.
What's your best advice for people right now?
It's funny. So it was Kirk, correct?
Kirk, yes.
Again, good with numbers, bad with names. That's how we mathematicians roll, right? So Kirk, we talked about the inflation because you're worried about, when you start talking about gold and everything, you're worried about the dollar. And inflation is generally not the price of goods going up. It's really the cost of the value of the dollar going down. So you need more dollars to buy the same amount of goods and services. So that's why I went to inflation. But if our previous listener, Kirk, was talking about really something more sinister, if he's talking about just collapse of the dollar, that maybe we'll lose our status as the world reserve currency and get replaced. Yeah. And it'll be like maybe some of the South American currencies that we've seen in history that have gotten devalued, had hyperinflation. If you're thinking about something like that, then having a little bit of gold, a little bit of silver in a portfolio may not be the worst thing in the world. Because it can hold some value if you get a massive devaluation. But here's the thing. If you spend a lot of your net worth planning for the doomsday scenario, you may be protected against doomsday, but you won't be protected against everything else because you won't have enough income. You certainly won't have income that's inflation-proof. Why do I say that? Because silver doesn't pay any income. Gold doesn't pay any income. Bitcoin doesn't pay any income, right?
Right.
So you need to, and you used to be able to stake your Bitcoin, but Sam Bankman-Fried made that a lot riskier. so much for that. So the reality is that you want to have maybe a little bit for maybe 5% for a doomsday scenario, but a lot of your money still has to be for what if the economy gets bad, maybe gets up close to doomsday, but isn't quite doomsday. And that's where having things that generate income makes sense, right? We always talk on the show about bonds and bond-like instruments. We always talk about being able to generate 5-6% of income.
Right, through active management of the portfolios, all
That's
of that.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And to have an inflation hedge by reinvesting some of that income, not spending it all. So the old 4% cash flow rule, well, if you can get 6 and you can take 4, well, then you get to reinvest the other 2, and that gives you a little bit of inflation hedge, right?
Yep.
We also know that you don't want to start spending principal in your early retirement years, but if you get out into your 80s and you want to start spending a little principal, well, that's not the worst thing in the world because you don't have to, at that point, worry about 30, 35 more years. You're already in your 80s. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
Or stock market, right? Good high dividend stocks will typically will typically have an increase in dividends over time. And that's an inflation hedge. Why? Because companies can typically pass through the increase of costs of goods and services with an increased retail price. So therefore, they can protect their bottom line, their profit margins. They can protect and increase their dividends over time. So again, when you're in retirement, it's all about the income. And when you're worried about inflation in retirement, it's all about inflation-proofing the income. So it's not just about the doomsday scenario and if the dollar just totally gets destroyed and you have gold and silver, but it's about everything else than that, because there are people who thought doomsday in 1900 and 1950 and the year 2000. And if they put their entire life savings, Sarah, planning for a doomsday scenario, and it hasn't come, they'd be having a pretty poor retirement.
Right.
And that's not what we want for our listeners.
No, we don't. We want our listeners to have the best retirement possible, because you've worked hard all of these years. So that's why income, really, like Dave said, income investing is really going to be your best bet against inflation. So it's been a great show. If you enjoyed this show, if you want to share it with your friends, if you think others may benefit from listening or watching the show, please feel free to go to our website. It's retirementincomesourceradio.com. You can listen to all of our past episodes. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which I think is still under our old show, The Income Generation. But all of our new Retirement Income Source episodes are on the YouTube channel too.
Yes, we appreciate it if you share this with your friends, but more importantly, thank you for joining us this week, and we hope you'll join us again next week for another episode. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income.